Lexi, for your kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me this evening. When I lived in New York City, I first became familiar with the school through lectures like this. My interest grew into admiration as I learned of the quality of the teaching here, as the school recognizes the importance of establishing a foundation based upon skills before a personal vision can be thoughtfully explored. One important part of that process is a familiarity with the language of your chosen discipline. This language is the tool we use to think about, communicate, and make sense from what we create and what we see. We can't know the whole without being conversant with its parts. Tonight I'm going to present what I consider to be the basic elements of sculpture. There are 14 in total. They begin with the physical, everything is made of something, of course, and extend to the most ephemeral, which is memory. All are single words, ones that you are already aware of, but in different contexts. For both the maker and the viewer, these 14 compose the basic language of the art of sculpture. I grew up in a home in which my father made everything: the radio, the TV, and all the other appliances most purchased from stores. Even our family car was a made-up conglomeration of 4 or 5 variously variously colored wrecks reconstructed into one. An assemblage, crazy quilt that looked more like a camouflage Jeep than a 1950s family car. Where there ought to have been a carefully landscaped lawn, ours was a graveyard of aging parts, hemorrhaging oil into the barren ground. Forced to help him with his obsessive building, it's more out of pain than pride that I confess this. We were not the most popular family on the block, but those experiences helping him did teach me something important. What I learned was that stuff is made from more stuff. Buried within, and rarely seen at first, is more. The whole is the sum of its parts. Understanding requires probing below the surface. So even now, when I look at an object in my world, one that I don't understand, I try mentally or physically to take it apart. After my early experiences with building, something else happened along the way. When I was quite young, my father, for reasons I still can't fathom, would take me to the Seattle Art Museum. Later, when I was a teenager, I rode my bike and walked alone through the galleries, always stopping to marvel at the Asian jade collections. And also in the adjacent gallery, I spent time with a terracotta Hanawa warrior that dominated the space. It was the exquisite craftsmanship involved in carving glass-hard stone that drew me to the jade. But it was the mystery of the warrior that I found most captivating. Rising above the carefully assembled cylindrical body parts was the head. Its cut-out eyes returned my gaze. Through them I could experience the dark volume within. I tried to take it apart like a car, but I couldn't. A car is such a deliberate thing, while this sculpture seemed to a 14-year-old boy impossibly capricious. So the mystery of the sculpture remained. There were many things I needed to understand before I could begin to discover the parts that composed the whole of this mysterious thing. I had to wait. The elements of sculpture are the expressive vocabulary of the language of form. They are sculpture's irreducible facts. The elements are analogous to the parts of speech, nouns, verbs, adjectives, or the fundamentals of music, melody, harmony, rhythm, etc. As a young sculptor, I gave little thought to this formal language. The descriptive elements that constituted the objects I was making were embedded somewhere deep in my subconscious. I used them without giving much thought to, for example, the difference between volume and space. But at this time, two important things happened. One was minimalism, and through that work I became interested in its precursor, Russian constructivism. Both assumed it was possible to create non-figurative works that explored the expressive possibilities inherent in the elements. A dominant element could be the work's expressive content, and thus a sculpture could be self-referential. What both constructivism and minimalism asked for was a clarity of terminology, a clarity of language. What is the difference between surface and edge? And why do these differences matter? To answer the last question first, I'd like to go back many years to an experience that proved to me how closely tied understanding is to the embodied experience, and the important difference between how things appear to the eye versus how they are in our world. How understanding is a search, and again, beneath the surface is more. In the minds of most, the Statue of Liberty is out there, always has been, and always will be. It's the single most famous sculpture in the world, so much so that it appears more hatched, perhaps, than made by human hands. As a green, media-produced, two-dimensional image, it remains the symbol of freedom for billions of people. Yes to all that, but for me, it was first a sculpture, a long ways away, and most of the time about 3.5 inches high. One day, for some unknown reason, I wanted to experience it as I would any other sculpture. On the tour boat heading toward the statue, I worked to clear my mind of previous images and all that I had read. Things like who made it, how, why, when, etc. As it grew in size when I was on the boat, I was simultaneously struck by the presence of its rising mass. This is taken from the boat as I approach it, obviously. And now, next slide. Side view. I got out of the boat, walked up to the sculpture, next slide. And, it's something curious, but again, obvious, happens here, is that as I approach this, the sculpture, it's 150 feet tall and standing on the base of it, which is also 150 feet, the whole thing changes. From the slide, you would barely recognize it. Next slide. So I walked around the piece before exploring it further. Marvelous, isn't it, how it changes? Really startling. Again, obvious, but still a surprise. Next slide. And the next one. And this one is showing it under construction by Bertoldi in Paris. And we see also the incredible Eiffel interior structure, the arm in this view sticking up. Okay, next. Now, I went inside. And up to this point, I how can I say it? I ambivalently thought of it in terms of mass. Suddenly in going in, you can't help but say, oh my God, it's not mass any longer, it's a volume. It's a space enclosed by the outer shell of the copper. Walking up, I went up, next slide, to the crown and looked out and saw the battery, the boat, etc. That brought me to the island. Now here is, in one sense, the crux of what I am going to talk about in the rest of the lecture. And that is, in one sense, how can we carry around in our minds the opposition that you are aware of at this particular moment in time. Opposition. That this is a mass and it contains an interior volume. How do I understand those two things simultaneously? And precisely how do I give words to the fact that my experience of the sculpture has changed radically, that now it's two things and not just a mass. Okay, next slide. These are the elements of sculpture, 14 in total, that is really the basis of my book. It begins obviously with the materiality of the object, and then it moves through and ends with the most ephemeral, which is memory. Okay, next. Nancy Rubin's, I'm going to go through and show you one or two examples, sculptural examples of each one of the elements. Nancy Rubin's, which is material, and mostly the piece is composed of child's playground aluminum castings, painted. There is stainless steel cables within the piece, bent pieces of metal, both steel and aluminum, but it's made of an amalgam of stuff, just stuff. Next slide. Two similar pieces, the torso of a young man by Brancusi, the date is 1917. I'm showing you this, and my comments are going to be very brief, and I hope that you understand where we are with regard to the examples. So you make out of them what you need to make. The piece on the right is obviously cast bronze. The piece on the left is wood. Now, what happens with that hard metallic surface that's polished is it becomes, in a sense, it vanishes within the context of the surface, of the room, the space that it finds itself in. So we go from the, in a sense, inorganic to the organic, a tree, a piece of wood. This is the trunk of the tree. We can invert the piece, and these are limbs in both senses, I guess, of the word. And so, again, similar form, but one's emotional response to the piece is very different from the one on the left versus the one on the right. Next. Running Fence by Jean-Claude and Christo. If this, and the element here is place. This is Sonoma County, outside of San Francisco. You have the marvelous rolling hills that terminate at the water's edge. This piece would be a completely different work if it were in, let's say, Antarctica or the Sierra Desert. So it's a site-specific work, and it's about 18 feet high. So everything is made out of something, and everything has a place. And that place invariably influences how we understand what it is that we're looking at. Place, okay, next. Now, Catrizina Corbo, 1929, this is a reconstruction of one of her pieces. The element here is both surface and edge. This is, a surface. It's the outer whatever of my body, the outside of the rostrum. Edge is the bounding perimeter. It is the union of two surfaces, and in this case, it is both. The color explains the surface, the differences in color change how we understand the surface, the edge. Next is Chamberlain. I would say a cruel and mean texture. The piece is made out of torn, ripped, sawn pieces of stainless steel, and it's collapsed into a cube that is approximately 6.5 feet high. I confront the piece. When I confronted the piece for the first time, in a sense, I was fearful of the violence of the texture. The date of this is about 2005. Next is color. This is how we understand Greek sculpture. This is how the Greeks understood their own sculpture. And it's a very different way of reacting to basically the same sculpture. If anyone has any comments, thoughts, feelings, don't hesitate to interrupt me. And so this is a pediment, a pedimental work. And it's, well, I think it explains itself. Let's go on to the next one, which is the Picasso. Most of you probably have seen the Picasso, or saw the Picasso exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. There they had all 6 of the absinthe glass, which is this piece, and they're all painted differently. What I did was I took one piece and then colored over, and so that you could then imagine what Picasso possibly was looking at before the color was applied. It's interesting that the black area here, in a sense, flattens the piece, whereas you have this sort of bizarre stippling which changes one's understanding of the piece. Next. And speaking of how one reacts to color on a surface of a piece of sculpture, this is sort of a wonderful and extreme example. That red just has such a brilliant, powerful, pulsing presence to it that you have a hard time establishing that red place with the white place above. Next piece, next slide. 52 inches high. The work is by Charles Ray. We have the children who are as tall as the adults. The adults are as tall as the children. How do we reconcile this sort of this collision of scale? And it's, in a sense, spooky in the extreme. Next, mass, maybe 14 tons of forged steel by Richard Serra, and it's approximately 6 feet high. And it's mass as a present force. It is, its presence, as far as I'm concerned, comes very much from its physicality as a thing in our space. Next. This is by Aline, guerrara. It's about 6.5 feet tall, and this is mass as a number. Many, many pieces of cloth, many colors, textures, etc. And then within if you notice here, you see that there are all these mysterious legs. So then are these parts of figures that are supporting that mass, that number. And I intentionally paired this with the Serra because of the fact that it's, to a certain extent, it's a similar size and a similar form. Next. Michelangelo Pistoletto, and this is center of gravity. If we could eliminate this and just had the vertical, we have this, a strange situation in which the vertical seems to me to be happy with itself relative to center of gravity. As soon as he introduces this, and these are the pieces about 18 feet tall in the center of a traffic circle in Florence, and it's made out of stone. As soon as he introduces this, the horizontal, what you were certain of, that is the reliability of this verticality, all of a sudden is thrown into question. And so we have to somehow resolve this inconsistency in our minds. Next. Laura Schnettinger, and it's entitled Ornament, and it's about 2,000. You can see that it's suspended within the volume, the gallery space. And then she takes pantyhose and chopsticks and creates a membrane in tension in which we can easily penetrate into the interior volume of the sculpture in a way that is somewhat analogous to what I was talking about with regard to the Statue of Liberty. So I feel the exterior surface, I'm able to penetrate the surface into the interior volume. So volume. The next is Eva Hess, which for me is about space. I first saw this after her tragic death in the gallery. And at that point, it was possible to walk within the sculpture. And so my vertical the physicality of my being, however one wants to understand and describe it, was always bumping up against, not literally, but the space that the piece defined. I was walking around through here, and I felt always this the presence of the fiberglass forms. And also, sort of, another interesting aspect of the piece for me was the fact that you had these pods, we'll call them, that the piece was standing on, which were, of course, arranged on the floor. And so there was this sort of marvelous feeling of the piece rising up from the floor and enclosing the space that I was walking through. After space is movement. This is a very difficult piece to begin to describe. It's Rodin, it's 1877. There are many castings of this piece around. And what I'm fascinated by in the context of this is that just generally something that isn't always apparent is that the left leg is quite a bit longer than the right leg. And so we have what I'm talking about is this leg as being the left leg. And so left leg is both legs are mired into the base. If it's walking, it's not walking in the sense that I'm walking here, but it's the legs are stationary. And so we have to find and discover for ourselves what actually is moving here. If we understand walking as in terms of motion, what is moving? The torso is, of course, without arms and without a head. And because of the extended left leg, what is happening is that the torso is being propelled. That is, if we understand walking as moving through space, the torso is being propelled through space visually by these legs, but they aren't moving. And so there's this wonderful physicality of mass moving through space, but not by way of the power of its legs. Something else is going on. Next. Also movement. Okay, movement. I'm not certain that that's sculpture, but it's certainly movement. Okay, light is next. This is Aphram 1 by James Turrell. The date is around 1967. What he's done here is he's projected a flat plane of light, of high intensity light, into the corner of a room. When you walk into the room, you can't help but feel the presence, the volume, maybe a better word is mass, the mass of the cube of light. And the presence of the fact of that, well, I was calling it a cube, and so, yes, it's a cube. The presence of that cube is overpowering and totally convincing. That is the illusion. Next. Let's go back to that one. There were a couple of things I also wanted to say about light, and that is that works outside, large sculptures outside are lit obviously with sunlight. Skylights in museums are lit by the natural light. Also in museums you have incandescent lights hung from the ceiling, and also there are works of sculpture that project their own light, for instance neon pieces. Next. Memorial, and this is the last of the elements, which is memory. So this is on the south corner of Central Park, General Sherman being led by the Angel of Victory. And this is a sort of normal commemorative memorial. Next is a work by Felix Gonzalez Torres. It's a memorial for Ross. The date is 1991. His lover Ross dies from AIDS, and Gonzalez Torres wanted to memorialize his life. And he did so by, with this pile of hundreds, maybe even thousands of wrapped candies that are in the corner of the gallery space, asking by way of a wall card that the viewer come and take a candy, unwrap it, and eat it as a memorial to Ross. Next. So these are my elements. The next section is I closely examine a work by Robert Gober. These are the elements of sculpture. The question now arises, how can the viewer use these to begin to understand a particular work? To illustrate this process, I have selected a sculpture that eludes and confounds easy analysis. It's a work by Robert Gober entitled Untitled of 2006. At first glance, a patio chair dominates along with seated, dismembered legs, possibly belonging to a young boy. But that's a superficial first look. There is much more to be seen here and understood. By asking questions and using the general vocabulary found in the elements as a guide, I will select those I believe Gober used to express his artistic will, knowing that no single sculpture will contain all 14. After discovering these and discussing how they relate to specific parts of the sculpture, I will attempt to discover what it all means based upon objective, empirical evidence seen in the sculpture itself. Not about what I want it to be, or even what Gober may have meant it to be, but what the sculpture is as an autonomous physical thing. After considering all 14, I believe the primary elements are material, color, scale, and memory. I will begin with his material choices, as they are, interestingly enough, paradoxical and key to some of what the sculpture may be about. The dominant form here is the chair. It appears to be a cheap, indestructible vinyl patio chair. But what we see here is an extremely difficult to make, fragile stoneware casting. The Benjamin Moore branded paint can has been cast in lead, crystal glass, and carefully painted to look like the original. Can you see the chair? Is that clear? I mean the paint can. Okay. The Benjamin Moore paint can has been cast in lead crystal glass and carefully painted to look like the original. The wax legs wear children's blue knitted socks and white sandals and look as if they could belong to a young boy. Black hairs have been embedded in them, and there's a Band-Aid on the left leg below the knee. The artist made all of these parts, giving utmost attention to every detail. Creating new objects from unexpected materials implies a completely different level of engagement from buying or finding them. Decisions such as what materials to use and how deeply one should become involved in the process of making are vital questions for both the sculptor and the viewer. Materials can be meaning. When considering color and scale, all these objects conform to our expectations except for one, and that is the pallid beeswax legs. With regard to color, they are almost painfully too white and too thin. And they sprout those black hairs again. The flesh-colored Band-Aid strip, the Gainsborough blue boy blue knitted socks, and the white sandals with aluminum pull-tab buckles almost give the breath of life to these limpid wax cylinders. The objects are their true size or scale. But something mysterious happens when we experience the sculpture in person. The legs appear to diminish in scale while the chair grows larger in the imagination. This adult-sized chair is a constant reminder to the boy that he is still a child. This illusion is heightened by the vague similarity in form and color between the chair, and the boy's legs, and the fact that his legs are too short for the dominant chair that supports them. The feet dangle helplessly inches off the ground. Floating freely, they lose their remembered size in our mind, since scale needs a reference point. And without it, the chair becomes a monumental, looming presence in the composition. The element memory is significant relative to the chair. Chairs act as our body's surrogates. They have arms, legs, a seat, and a back. This chair acts as the stage where the action of the sculpture takes place. Although the chair is deceptively fragile, it metaphorically and physically holds the composition together. So do we now have enough information to speculate as to the meaning of the work? I believe we do. The legs are made of beeswax, a fragile, easily melted material, and are formed with little attention given to anatomy. Given the obsessive, detailed representation of the other objects, this is a surprising change in emphasis. They are generic forms that could almost belong to anything, but not to anyone. The Band-Aid covers a real wound. The sandals and feet establish a persona for the legs as they wrap around the used paint can. Benjamin Moore is a paint company, but might this also be the boy's name? The paint can is strategically placed in the genital area of the boy's legs. By this presence, could the crystal container represent the fragility of a young boy approaching puberty? Children often mask their vulnerabilities and inadequacies, and paint is used to cover and conceal. The breakable paint container literally and figuratively holds the dangling legs into position. If removed, they would slide helplessly to the floor. The black hairs growing from the boy's legs may represent the passage of time. The human frailty of childhood may be why Gober chose glass for the paint can, and why he placed it on the seat of this brittle and easily broken chair. In childhood, our body feels awkward, uncomfortable, and clumsy. We may doubt its reliability and therefore our tenuous place in a confusing world. In conclusion, it's important to note something that to this point has remained unsaid, as the implications go to the heart of my understanding of the sculpture. Perhaps too obvious to be seen at first, the boy has two left feet, and in their clumsy frailty, they dangle helplessly, unable to reach firm ground. In attempting to search for some tentative understanding of Untitled, I first tried to determine the elements Gober used, then ask why these and not others. Then to determine the implications of those choices. The elements are the facts of sculptural form. So it was imperative that I pursued answers knowing full well that the conversation between the viewer and the sculpture I am advocating is only a beginning, a first step toward understanding, a small opening at best. There is no right way to analyze how we respond to a sculpture as complex as this one. But we can attempt to search for answers that remain within the empirical evidence found within the sculpture itself. It's not what I wanted the sculpture to be, rather it is what it is. Understanding is a constant search to reconcile what we see with what we know. My interpretation of the Gober work may be way off the mark. There are still many unanswered questions here, and this is as it should be. To conclude, throughout our conversation this evening, I have assumed that in some mysterious way, a sculpture is animate, and therefore able to answer the questions it may provoke in the viewer. The elements of sculpture may provide a guide for asking these questions, but a visceral experience is more complex than merely defining words or making inquiries. While seeing may encourage thinking, A more rewarding response involves more than sight alone. A sculpture is another object in our world, and so asks to be understood using our senses. I walk around it, seeing how a multitude of reflections dissolve its hard form into space. I taste the red of its soft cloth surface. I hear the steel echo of its blunt, hard edge. I touch the cold of its oblique angle. I smell the warm aroma of its pungent light. Familiarity with the elements provides an objective, factual foundation upon which subjective meaning may be reasonably constructed. The words are only a beginning. They define the parts that make the whole. The challenge is to build upon the elements I have presented here and discover how knowledge of them provides an opening to the deeper, more spontaneous emotions that the experience of sculpture may arouse in the viewer. The understanding I'm advocating here is an ongoing search rather than an endpoint. Finally, the essence of a sculpture lies beyond our ability to fully comprehend its form. Both meaning and mystery are found in the pleasures derived from discovering what the hand of the sculptor has created and the imagination of the viewer has experienced. And this is why I look at sculpture. So that's the end.